Hello everyone, today I will be going through the speedrunning principles behind the map Scythe of Amon to mark the end of my speedrunning hobby. With my career picking up, I figured it's time to finally move on from such a time-consuming task, but be assured that I will still dabble in co-op here and there, especially with mutations. Anyways, Scythe of Amon has been my favorite map to speedrun, as evidenced by my multiple records on this map. Because all 5 objectives are active from the start, the map is open to so much creativity and sequence breaking in a way that the devs would never have imagined. I will be pulling knowledge from all the past speedruns I have done on this map, so that by the end of this video, you too will be able to set records on this map, or your money back. We'll begin by talking about how the overall Sliver Order is determined. This is something that most viewers should notice very easily when watching the runs and forms the backbone of routing. It is called the reverse clear, and it was first performed by one of the original Tahaka speedrunners. Afterwards, I began applying it towards many commanders, and now it is unthinkable to do any Scythe of Amon speedrun without sequence breaking the map. We have a good idea of the Sliver Order intended by the developers: natural, expansion, north, west, and finally northwest. The way you see the relative difficulty is by comparing the defenders around each sliver, and they definitely get scarier as you go up the list. Another good tell is the number of void rifts around each sliver, with the easier ones starting with just 1, while the more difficult ones have multiple. We also know that each time a sliver is destroyed, the remaining ones essentially go up a level in difficulty by spawning an additional void rift and additional higher tier units. Because of this behavior, difficult slivers scale very quickly with increasing levels compared to the easier slivers. The northwest sliver is already difficult enough at level 1, but becomes exponentially more difficult at level 5. To the point only late-game armies can face it head-on. Meanwhile, the natural sliver at level 5 is probably not even at the northwest sliver's level 1 difficulty. This means we are incentivized to destroy the more difficult slivers as early as possible to prevent their exponential scaling. This means you should always start with the northwest sliver and end with the natural sliver, right? Well, not exactly. This is where all the other factors and nuances come in, and we'll discuss them one by one. First, we need to think about how each commander will reach each sliver. The northwest sliver is very far away, tucked behind multiple enemy encampments. This means a conventional army will have a tough time reaching the location, and even then, an army trying to fight the northwest sliver early probably won't have the necessary power. Typically, the only tools that can reliably handle the northwest sliver at that time are top bars and heroes, and even then you need to gain access to the sliver. Top bars typically require a spotter like an observer to bypass the enemy defenses and gain vision of the sliver, which is exactly what Karex does, while Raynor obviously has no issues gaining vision for his top bar calldowns. As for heroes, they need some method to transport them to the sliver, usually through teleportation, but generally heroes are more flexible in what sliver they attack first since they have so much strength to begin with. Top bars, on the other hand, can only snipe the first 2 slivers, after which the sliver health becomes too high, and thus require an army to handle the rest, so you really do want to try sniping the toughest slivers first. But the point of top bar sniping is to handle the early objectives while growing an army safely back home, so the reduced flexibility doesn't feel too bad. Surprisingly, not many commanders attack the northwest sliver first. Many commanders actually attack it second, and this has to do with their spotting limitations. Many commanders simply do not have a way to get a spotter to the northwest sliver in time for the first attack, which should happen around 3 or 4 minutes, which is when the first top bars and heroes start becoming available. The best spotting method available to all commanders is sneaking a worker to the left side of the map near the west sliver, which means many commanders would prefer to fight the west sliver first. There are many examples of this start, including Nova, Tychus, and Alarak. These commanders will then attack the northwest sliver as a second objective, following the principle of getting rid of the toughest sliver as quickly as possible. Abathur starts with the west sliver first as well, but for a different reason, which we will discuss next. Army mobility is probably the biggest constraint in the Sliver Order in these speedruns. Unlike heroes and top bars, most commanders' armies will not be able to reach freely around the map. Referring back to our Abathur example, while Brutus have global transport, Leviathans do not. This means the objectives must be as close to each other as possible. Since the first Leviathan is more about the second sliver, we want the second sliver to be close to the third. If Abathur began with the northwest sliver first and west second, he would have to take the expansion sliver as a third, which is not ideal due to biomass as well as the fact that we are destroying an easy sliver too early. Ground armies obviously are the least mobile, and speedruns that don't involve teleporting ground armies around will always use some form of loop, which I actually like to call Lil Arin loop, since I spearheaded this route. In general, you can start with any sliver and then go around in a circle, but the most optimal loop involves sniping the northwest and west slivers and then moving counterclockwise, ending with the north sliver. This is a route that Raynor and Carrick's use, and even Vorazun to a certain extent, even if she snipes the west sliver before northwest. Meanwhile, commanders with army teleportation abilities mostly just have to worry about the cooldown of their teleportation, so they're still incentivized to plan their route to include some physical movement of their armies. For example, Nova will move her Liberators from the west sliver to northwest instead of using her Griffin transport, since she needs it to move them to the north sliver afterwards, otherwise the Liberators would have a very lengthy journey. Alarak, on the other hand, has a very short cooldown on his Death Fleet that allows him to basically teleport from sliver to sliver as long as he has a unit spotting. As a quick aside, attack waves do not affect the Sliver Order that much, only the timings when each sliver is attacked. This is because the first and attack waves are selected through RNG to allow the optimal Sliver Order, and the third and fourth attack waves hit late enough so that the far sliver is already destroyed, so that every commander should be intercepting the attack waves close to their next target. In addition, commanders can try to ignore the attack waves after the first one, since attack waves take about a minute to reach the base and perhaps 30 to 45 seconds more to destroy it, providing a fairly large window of time to destroy the last sliver before the game ends from having all the structures destroyed. A run that ends before 9:45 can comfortably skip the second attack wave, while a run that ends before 10:45 or so can skip the third attack wave. Getting back to the topic of Sliver Order as one final point, commanders can choose to destroy the natural sliver first if they have certain constraints on their mobility or powers. The best example is Phoenix, where our angry zealot Caldalis can kill the natural sliver before the Arbiter suit can be called down to teleport him to the other slivers. Since Phoenix almost exclusively relies on sniping slivers instead of actually fighting the defenders, the added difficulty on the other four slivers don't matter as much. Vorazun is another example where Shadow Guards are available before the first time stop, so it is optimal to use them to kill the natural sliver and be transported to the second sliver just in time to snipe it during time stop. Like Phoenix, Vorazun almost exclusively relies on sniping during time stop, so the added difficulty in the sliver defenses due to destroying the natural sliver does not matter. The dual speedrun is yet another example, and I will let you think about how this principle applies to the dual run. Remember that with speedruns, you're trying to accomplish more with as little as possible. You aren't going to utterly smash the slivers like you might in a less hardcore run, where you simply build up a death ball that can overwhelm any defenses the slivers will have. Here, we will discuss the various ways you can efficiently fight the slivers, and some of these methods should be applicable to non-speedrun situations to make your lives easier, especially in mutations. We begin by discussing sniping methods, which bypass the defenses altogether, saving time not only by avoiding unnecessary fights, but also by preserving the army, and thus is generally the fastest method. Remember that in any percent run, anything you do that isn't attacking the objective is a time loss. We have already mentioned two sniping methods in the previous section, top bars and calldowns. The top bar method is the simplest and the easiest of the bunch. You simply get a unit to spot for you, and then it is a matter of pointing and clicking to delete the sliver of your choice. The only speedrunning difficulty comes from reaching the sliver on time and making sure to use a top bar ability as soon as it comes off cooldown. Vorazun's time stop sniping requires a bit more execution to properly position the Dark Templar around the sliver for maximum DPS, but most other top bar abilities are nukes which simply require casting. Calldowns are less safe because they can be attacked by the defenders and thus can be destroyed. The most familiar example I have would be Raynor with his Hyperion and Duskwings, and Duskwings are especially vulnerable and require Hyperion support to properly do their job. You still want to minimize fighting, which is even more important given that calldowns are limited in time. Where you summon the cooldown and what dangerous units you snipe are all considerations you have to make for maximum effectiveness. Otherwise, you ignore all other enemy units and focus on destroying the sliver before the cooldown expires or is destroyed. And on the topic of calldowns, I will count Alarak's 3rd Prestige Mothership and Nova's Liberators into the calldown category, even if they are permanent units. For the first two slivers, Alarak's Mothership only kills anti-air units, after which all focus is placed on the sliver, which is essentially what calldown sniping does. Likewise, Nova's Liberators snipe some ground anti-air units and then snipe down the slivers, while the defensive drones protect them from enemy air units. Even Tychus employs sniping by using Sam's demolition charges for the northwest sliver, but note that generally heroes do not snipe, as they do need to fight a significant portion of the defenders before they can attack the slivers. The final sniping method that hasn't been mentioned yet is the detector sniping method, employed by Phoenix and the dual Vorazun Raynor runs. As the name suggests, this method involves disabling or sniping nearby detectors and sniping the slivers under cloak. This is the most difficult method to execute since Amon has plenty of detectors across the map, which will begin moving towards your cloaked units whenever the closest detector is disabled or killed. It requires good knowledge of detector pathing behavior, as well as disabling the detectors quickly to prevent the army from taking critical damage. This is especially important when facing against slivers that use death grip crystals, as those crystals can immediately grab your army if there is even a tiny window of time when detection is available. Curiously enough, Phoenix does prefer to activate Cloak a little bit late to let some of his sentinels get grabbed by death grip crystals, since that will refresh Avenging Protocol on Caldalis, who does not get grabbed and is the sole DPS source for the speedrun. For the slivers themselves, their powers add an element of RNG when fighting them or even sniping them if you're using units instead of top bars. This is usually the biggest part of frustration when rolling for the right RNG in the speedruns, since they're added on top of attack wave direction RNG as well as AI race RNG, and you actually don't find out what sliver RNG you have until you get to the second sliver. We're aware of the three powers that the slivers have: Stun, Death Grip Crystals, and Blue Circle of Death. The first sliver always has no power, while slivers 2 through 4 will cycle through one of 3 combinations, and the final sliver has all 3 powers available. Generally, Stun tends to be considered the weakest of the 3 powers since it doesn't do any direct damage. Death Grip Crystals versus Blue Circle depends on the commander, although commanders with large armies tend to find the Blue Circle to be more difficult due to massive potential damage. But just like the Sliver Order, the preferred speedrun order of sliver powers does not simply come to Blue Circle first and Stun last. Talking about the stun power first, we note that even though stun is safe for the army, it is a major source of time loss. The longer you take to destroy the sliver, more times you get stunned, and each stun lasts a few seconds. Since slivers gain more health as time goes on, stun results in more time loss the later it appears. Sometimes this time loss is necessary. As previously mentioned, the blue circle is devastating for army commanders, not only because the blue circle itself does so much damage, but also because the sliver defenders can deal so much damage while your army is busy dodging and become scattered in the process. These commanders tend to lose DPS by virtue of losing their forces, so generally it is better to deal with the stun at the 4th sliver to preserve DPS for the final. On the flip side, heroes have very little issue with the blue circle, but stand to lose a lot of DPS from stun, since individual heroes tend to have lower DPS than armies. They definitely prefer to have stun earlier to minimize this DPS loss, and they're unconcerned about the difficulty of the blue circle later. For these commanders, the preferred power order is stun, death grip, then blue circle. However, as you might expect, even this principle has an exception. Commanders whose hero DPS grows over time may prefer to have stun second. Abathur is a good example because he fights the second sliver with 3 Brutalists, and the third with 3 Brutalists and 2 Leviathans. The third sliver has about 25% more total health than the second sliver, while Abathur's total DPS essentially doubles, meaning Abathur actually kills the third sliver faster than the second. Stun will therefore cause the least amount of DPS loss on the third sliver, while we know ultimate evolutions do not really care about the other 2 sliver powers. One last thing to note about stun is that it can interfere with the cloak sniping technique. Stun will activate whether or not the sliver can see your units, and that little bit of DPS loss can be enough for Amon to get detection back before you destroy the sliver and get out of the way. This is what happens with Phoenix for the third sliver, where stun will prevent Caldalis from destroying the sliver on time before stasis runs out. As for the Death Grip Crystals, since they do not affect heroes, only army commanders have to consider them in the speedrun plans. Of course, in the speedrun context, the Death Grip Crystals are considered free slivers with a caveat. RNG decides if the Death Grip Crystals make or break the run. If the crystals spawn in very bad locations, you're probably going to straight up lose most of your army and have to restart. Otherwise, you simply kill the Death Grip Crystals and get a stress-free sliver. There isn't really anything in between, so you just fight the sliver and hope for the best. Nova in particular has to submit to the will of RNG because she has absolutely no answer to Death Grip Crystals if her Liberators get grabbed, so only runs that have crystals spawning on the opposite side of the Liberators will work. And before we move on to the next power, I should mention that Death Grip Crystals can no longer grab your units if the sliver power changes, so you do not have to worry if you see a crystal near a sliver that is casting Blue Circle, for example. Finally, we discussed the Blue Circle. We already talked a little about how we take the Blue Circle in consideration alongside stun. Since the Blue Circle is so dangerous to the army, it is more optimal for army commanders to try fighting against the Blue Circle as early as possible. If these commanders can snipe the second sliver with top bars, then they might want the second sliver to have the blue circle, where it will pose absolutely no threat. However, the blue circle tends to be dangerous for call-down sniping, since call-downs can be killed by the blue circle before they finish the job, meaning they would rather have the blue circle for the third sliver. It is possible to micro the call-downs to avoid damage from the blue circle, but since the Void Rifts will begin respawning anti-air, this ends up prolonging the fight to unsustainable levels. As for heroes, they do not have much of a choice if they wish to have stun for the second sliver, but if they can do okay with having stun for the third sliver, they can face blue circle early and face less risk of losing the hero during a chaotic fourth sliver. Now, what about all three powers combined? Well, this is not an RNG consideration since the final sliver will always have all three powers, but it is still possible to do some planning for the final fight. The final sliver is predictable in how it uses its powers. When you fight near the very edge of its range, it will try to hit you with a blue circle. You may notice this happening in the first moments of your arrival at the sliver. Afterwards, it will cycle between two steps, summoning 2 Death Grip Crystals, and then alternating between stun and blue circle a few times. You want to try and control the fight so that you deal as much damage as possible during the Death Grip phase, especially when an army is involved. Stun obviously causes a direct loss of DPS, while the blue circle causes an indirect loss by forcing the army to split. This is why you have to make a decision on how long to fight the defenders before you focus on the sliver itself. The longer you fight the defenders, less time you have to DPS the sliver before the stun blue circle part of the cycle. Going back to the Raynor example, he takes a little bit of time to get rid of melee and hit scan units, and then focuses down the sliver under the cover of point defense drones, allowing him to kill the sliver before the first stun. On the other hand, Abathur lacks the DPS but is able to ignore the blue circle, so he does not lose time from dodging. It is a balancing act in deciding how much of the defenders to fight and how much to tank, all for the sake of minimizing time loss from the stun blue circle cycles. Moving on to the next part of sliver fights, we discuss different ways to handle sliver defenders. Remember that damage done to anything other than the objectives is time loss in any percent speedruns, so we have strong incentives to minimize fighting the units defending each sliver. We have already discussed how sniping bypasses defenders altogether, but what about when you have to assault slivers directly? As you will see, there are methods that speedrunners can use to minimize the total health of non-essential enemies that they have to fight. The first method is relatively straightforward, and many people should be able to incorporate it into their play. It makes use of the fact that slivers need to update their defenses when they go up a difficulty level from one of them being taken out. New rifts tend to appear about 30 seconds after a difficulty level increase, and then they queue new units to be produced, which take about another 30 seconds or so. If you attack the next sliver immediately after the previous, then the sliver will only be at the early stages of updating its defenders and will essentially be at the previous level of difficulty. The longer you take to get to the next sliver, the more difficult the defenses will be, so commanders with teleport abilities will greatly benefit from this method. And as you can see from this clip, Abathur makes use of this method using his Brutalist Deep Tunnel, so he essentially fights each sliver at one lower difficulty level than it should be. A more refined version of this method involves hitting multiple slivers at once and is much more difficult to execute. This is typically paired with sniping strategies, with one sliver being sniped while the army attacks the defenders of another. This is more advantageous than the previous method because the Void Rifts are still stuck at a low difficulty level and will only try to replenish the low level defenders instead of producing higher tier units from a higher level. This also saves time by having the defenders essentially cleared out by the time the other sliver is sniped, so that you can begin attacking the sliver itself right away, almost entirely erasing the time loss from having to fight the defenders. There are many examples of this in established speedruns, as you probably noticed from all the clips shown so far. Heroes are fantastic for doing this since they're fairly resilient even if you have a hard time splitting your attention, while commanders like Raynor have to manage units on both slivers and need to multitask very well or risk losing both slivers. Now we get to an advanced technique that I developed called Angry Structure Stall, or AS. Something that makes Scythe of Amon unique compared to the other maps is that the objective defenses regenerate themselves over time. This is part of the reason why the map is so difficult for inexperienced players, because a sliver will recover from any failed push, so that by the time you return, you've made no progress, but the timer is still ticking down. This is made worse by the attack waves later on that tend to come at inconvenient timings and directions, so if you are forced to retreat from a sliver to deal with the attack wave, you will have traded your forces with the sliver for no gain. Knowing when you're ready to push a sliver and having the force of will to commit to the push are what separate the experienced players from the inexperienced, and why speedrunners generally do not find Scythe of Amon to be particularly difficult. Firstly, one of your highest priorities in fighting Slivers should be killing the Void Rifts, since they will continue to spit out extra units as long as they are alive. In a speedrun, this will add to a bunch of extra health that you have to destroy, and in mutations, it can tip the scales in Amon's favor if the rifts respawn higher tier units on your tired army. But if you destroy all the rifts and retreat, you will return to find that the rifts have respawned and replenished all the defenders depending on how much time has elapsed. Does this mean it's impossible to clear a sliver of defenses and come back later to deal with it? This is where Ass comes in. The Slivers do not rebuild their Void Rifts randomly. If you have vision of their respawn location, they will not respawn. This is why the Slivers only seem to rebuild when you retreat and seem utterly helpless if you have them completely surrounded in a sustained attack. However, this is not the case for Void Rifts that are scheduled to spawn for the first time when a Sliver goes up a difficulty level. As you can see for the Raynor speedrun, while the original Void Rift on the top right side of the Sliver never respawns, the rift on the left, which is scheduled to spawn when the Sliver goes up to level 2, spawns even though the army had vision of that area. Because of the scheduled spawns that cannot be blocked, you cannot simply clear out the defenders, put a unit or structure to maintain vision, clear another Sliver, and return to find a Sliver still naked. Well, except for one Sliver. That Sliver would be the natural Sliver, which does not have a scheduled spawn until level 3, which spawns at the upper right area of the Sliver. This means you can clear the defenders, which are extremely easy at level 1, and be able to keep the Sliver undefended until you have cleared 2 other Slivers. And since the scheduled rift still takes 30 seconds after the second Sliver's death to actually be created, you have that extra time to work on the third Sliver and still make it to the natural Sliver if you have enough DPS, which is what Raynor and even Abathur can do, although Abathur needs to divert a Brutalist to kill the scheduled rift. This was a huge discovery for Scythe of Amon speedrunning. It was originally discovered for Abathur, where the Spore Crawler used for luring would curiously keep the Sliver undefended if left uprooted nearby. A while later, I realized its significance and began applying it to multiple commanders, and it should be fairly obvious why this is so significant. Ass leaves the natural Sliver completely helpless, making it a free Sliver with the only fighting being the extremely easy fight against the defenders at the lowest level, which can be done while the other Slivers are being sniped, resulting in absolutely no time loss from the fight itself. The only weakness is that it forces the natural Sliver to be either 3rd or 4th, which may be awkward for certain commanders, but it is still a very strong incentive to have a free 3rd or 4th Sliver. And before we conclude, we have a couple final points to add. First, we should note that we call this technique Angry Structure Stall, even though units can do the same thing. This is because units are vulnerable to Death Grip Crystals and the Blue Circle, and the Sliver will inevitably cycle through at least one of those powers. This makes units unviable for the technique, so structure should always be used for this purpose. And secondly, the technique is different based on the AI race. The exact composition of the units defending each Sliver differs slightly based on the AI race, and as it turns out, the North Sliver tries to help replenish the natural Sliver's defenders, as you can see from this clip. Zerg AI will spawn reinforcement Zerglings very early, causing the structure used for the technique to come under attack quite early. Against Terran, no Zerglings are sent, but a Marine at a later time, giving a much longer timing window before the angry structure falls. Each commander, therefore, must consider whether or not they can properly defend the structure and decide whether or not the natural Sliver must be taken as 3rd or 4th. At this point, we have covered essentially everything there is to know about Scythe of Amon speedrunning. Most commanders benefit from at least some of these principles, with Dehaka being an odd exception due to him simply being so strong against enemy units to the point he does not benefit much from skipping fights. But I think it would still be useful to see how these principles come together for a real speedrun, so I will go over how the route was decided for one of the commanders, Alarak. The speedrun actually begins with setting up Ass using the first overcharge. There is no way to use overcharge for the first 2 Slivers since there is no safe route for the probe, so this makes good use of an overcharge that would otherwise be wasted. A probe is also sent to the west to spot for the mothership, following the principle of going to the most difficult Sliver as early as possible. As you can imagine, there isn't a way to safely get a spotter up to the northwest Sliver in time for the mothership. The mothership uses the call-down sniping method for the west and northwest Slivers. It snipes all anti-air, including Void Rifts that can spawn more anti-air, and then it focuses down the Slivers, ignoring everything else. A destroyer is sent to the northwest as a spotter for teleport, and since destroyers are used alongside the mothership for the northwest sliver, the most ideal sliver power is stun. Death Grip crystals only work if they do not grab the destroyers, otherwise they delay sliver DPS enough for too many anti-air units to respawn. The situation is similar for Blue Circle, where the time wasted dodging will cause too many anti-air units to respawn. In the meantime, Alarak takes care of the first wave, which needs to come from the west so that the second attack wave does not intersect with the final sliver. Alarak will handle the remaining defenders around the natural sliver so that overcharged pylons can be set up, and then he goes to the north sliver to spot for the next mothership teleport. With Alarak's help, the Death Fleet can finally assault slivers head-on. However, we now use the principle of sniping one sliver while clearing defenders of another. The natural sliver receives Zergling reinforcements from the north sliver because the optimal AI race is Zerg. Therefore, the natural sliver must be cleared as the third, using overcharge to snipe it for free, while Alarak's forces clear the defenders of the north sliver when they are only at level 3 difficulty. You can see some of the sliver assault principles being used, with priority given to sniping rifts, while some emphasis given to enemy units to minimize loss of destroyers. When this natural sliver is taken out, the north sliver jumps to level 4, but everything has been cleared already, so it is a helpless sliver and simple to take out, even if its power is a blue circle, which is why the sliver power combination is optimal. And finally, Alarak teleports just outside the expansion sliver, taking advantage of the mothership's relatively low teleportation cooldown. At this point, the sliver is just trying to update the defenses to the highest level, but we are assaulting them before the update is complete, showing that Alarak uses all 3 of the sliver reinforcement principles discussed in the previous section. You can also see more of the sliver assault principles in action here, with some focus placed on the void rifts to prevent higher tier reinforcements, and then quickly taking out the death grip crystals. After that, all the focus is placed on the sliver itself, with the goal of killing it before the stun blue circle cycles cause too much DPS loss. The balance between fighting defenders and focusing the sliver was done such that there was no need to bother dodging the first blue circle. The second attack wave should be reaching the main base, but it doesn't matter since the game is already over. So, there you have it. This is the compilation of all Scythe of Amon speedrunning knowledge that I have gathered so far. I hope this was informative to you even if you don't plan to speedrun yourselves. I did have a lot of fun and I guess some frustration during my speedrunning career, and I think leaving this knowledge behind is a good way to retire. But as I said at the start, I will still be around the community doing very casual speedruns if time permits. Of course, speedrunning always calls to me after all, and I will dabble in mutations every now and then. Anyways, I would like to thank everyone for your attention, and I guess I'll see you around on pubs or elsewhere.